Record. So now I'm recording. Okay. I wanted to actually start by talking a little bit about story and meaning making, and kind of picking up that thing that you wrote in the book about, coming out of the broom closet. And I think that's such a great analogy for a number of reasons. Thinking about like my own experience of coming out as queer, you start to look back on your life and you begin to see other facets of experience that you couldn't at the time see, right? And so you start to like understand your own narrative and start to weave new storylines from your lived experiences. And I felt like that is, was that sort of your experience writing the book, or can you speak to that?
Let me just make sure I understand your question. So you're speaking about this idea of coming out of the broom closet, and did I like reflect on my life and look for ways in which I was doing that, maybe without realizing that that's what...
Yeah. It's sort of like how you look back at different experiences and see them in a new interpretive light once you start stepping into what your actual, like what your purpose is. And I guess, and because you say like life itself initiates each of us according to our own peculiar stories.
Yes. Well, we can talk about this all day because this is a really big question. It touches on so many things. First of all, it touches on just the idea of memoir in general, or writing memoir. What you're trying to do when you're writing memoir is essentially impose a narrative on something that ironically doesn't really have a narrative. Like our lives don't really have narratives, which is something that I discovered in trying to write a memoir. And then you're like kind of trying to impose a narrative on something that is kind of so much bigger than what we normally conceive of as narrative. But by way of analogy, in tarot, there's this idea of the soul card. Some of your listeners out there might be familiar with this, that you calculate according to your birth date. And often when I'm speaking about soul cards with my clients, I tell them that usually early in your life, the thing that troubles you most is related to what eventually you go on to discover is your purpose. And often our soul card shows up first as our enemy, essentially. Like the thing that eventually becomes our teacher often shows up first as our enemy. And so early in my life, the idea of enchantment, which I would say now is really the purpose of my life, which is to re-enchant the world, which I think that most witches are doing or feel is essential to their practice. The enchanted was kind of my enemy, because I felt pulled into realms of enchantment when, because I live in a white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal, colonialist culture, which eschews enchantment. It made it so that my experience of it was problematic and difficult and painful. And it wasn't really until I started to accept that there wasn't something wrong with me, that there was something wrong with the culture in which I lived, that I could revisit those times in my life and realize, in fact, they were messengers, they were guardians. Like I speak a lot in the book about Medusa, whose name means guardian, and the idea of her appearing to me in my early childhood and thinking that she was like an enemy or a monster. And she is, but she was a monster who was there to protect me and show me the way forward into my own power and authority and relationship to essentially the goddess, which, as we know, is not really favored by the status quo, the relationship to the goddess. So I don't know if that answers your question. I probably probably leaves a lot unanswered, but we can start with that.
It's a good place to start. And I have prepared all kinds of questions, but I also just am better with just kind of going with what's coming up, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah, we can go wherever you want.
So I guess like, can you talk a little bit about when you say the goddess, what it is that you're evoking there? And, you know, because, and again, I'm thinking when you were talking about enchantment, I started thinking about the ways that capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchy, colonial culture actually tries to enchant you into its way of, like, it does do, not enchantment, but it like does the mind fuck. I don't know, like what, right? Like into it, like mind fucks you into its perception that that's the only, it wants to take your imagination, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like coming into, like, you know, one of my first things that really started saving me was feminism, right? And starting to understand that there was other ways of seeing the world, but then when people would talk about the goddess, there would often be, this was like in the 90s, there would be this kind of like eye roll. And I would feel this eye roll, and I feel it, you know, and so, and which I don't feel anymore, but I think it could be, I think that the idea, like who the goddess is so multivalent. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, to clarify this idea of enchantment, borrowing a bit from Silvia Federici, who wrote Caliban and the Witch, and she was taking the idea, I believe, from Max Weber, a Frankfurt School economist, but talking about how essentially capitalism, which is, of course, essentially synonymous with colonialism, is a practice of disenchantment, and disenchantment is making it so that nothing is sacred, right? Like the mountains aren't sacred, the forests aren't sacred, people's lives aren't sacred, relationships aren't sacred. The only thing sacred is the accumulation of more capital. Mm-hmm. And so the process of enchantment then is or re-enchantment is to make things sacred again. And that means that the rivers and the mountains and the forests and our relationships and people and animals become sacred again. And the way that we make things sacred again is through ceremony and ritual. So that's what we're talking about when like witchcraft is about re-enchantment, is that we're doing ritual and ceremony in order to recognize and honor the numinous quality of the world and all beings in it. And then as far as, you know, what is the goddess? The goddess is the fundamental life force energy of the universe, is one way of looking at it. Mm-hmm. But of course, she's very multifaceted, right? Like, I see her as this like generative energy that you can feel or see, that emits, that things are emitted from, and that is, let me see if I can explain it. It's like kind of a mystical idea, so it's often beyond language. Lately I've been thinking of it a lot in terms of Arthurian legend, because in Arthurian legend, the sword, which is power or authority, is given to Arthur, the king, by the Lady in the Lake. And the Lady in the Lake comes from the land of women, which exists underneath the surface of the waters, on this stone that is like below the surface, and is like the fairylands, the land of Tir na Nog, the land of the unconscious and of dreams and of imagination. So in that sense, it is like this generative void space. It's the womb of all things. And from that, you know, power emerges or is presented into the world through this place. So I really see goddess as the source of power, the relationship to to the processes of birth and conception and imagination. But I don't mean to like make it into something like biological, like a biological feminine. I mean it more as like an imaginal relationship to conceiving and creation.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And it makes me think of art practice, right? You know, like that, like any kind of art practice also comes from that, not any kind, but like many kinds come from that space, right? And I guess, so I'm curious to also, like the way that I first came to know your work was actually through, I think the first time that I saw something of yours was in LA at Human Resources. I wasn't at the opening ceremony for the Oracle of Los Angeles. I think I was in Denver then, like during that performance, but I went to the gallery while the installation was up. And I remember seeing the small replica of City Hall and hearing that you had done, that you had given divined messages inside the space. And I think that, and it was interesting because when I was reflecting on this, like I obviously read the description of this in your book. But it was interesting because it was also when I think to that show, it's like one of the only thing that I remember in that space. And so it had this sort of like energy that imprinted, even without you there. But just so for people who haven't read or don't know, what this is, can you talk a little bit about the Oracle of Los Angeles? So, and that performance and how you were using art to sort of, a performance space to be as also an initiatory space.
Yeah. Well, so this was kind of really at the beginning of the process of me doing the work that I do now, which as your listeners may or may not know, I'm a quote unquote professional witch. That's how I make my living, and also a writer. I write about witchcraft in my book, Initiated Memoir of a Witch. But this was like very, very much at the beginning of this, stepping into this vocation, one might say. And when I was in grad school, I made kind of very angry work in resistance to capitalist patriarchy. And then when I got out of school, I realized that it was one thing to make work that's just against things that I found problematic or that I didn't like, but it's another thing to say what I'm for or what I want. And so at that point, I decided to start thinking about, well, what kind of world do I want to live in and what kind of world would I like to create? And I had been brought up practicing witchcraft because my mother is a witch. But I kind of thought it was her thing in the same way that, people who grow up, Protestants or Catholics might sort of reject the religion that they were brought up in. And I decided to kind of turn to the arts, thinking that the arts would be this enchanted world, this beautiful place where I could escape like the things that I didn't like about the world that I was living in. And that turned out to not be true. So I decided I was going to have to make the world that I wanted to live in, which is very fundamental to the practices of witchcraft. And so at that point there in my late 20s, I started to return to these earlier understandings of witchcraft, and in a way that I actually understood them better, having been away from them, in the same way that we might understand the country that we're from better when we live abroad for a certain amount of time and return. So this was one of my first attempts to kind of create the world that I wanted to live in. And yeah, I was still really coming from the position of, like a art school grad student. It was very early in my like post-grad life. So I expected when I made this work that people would react to it with some aesthetic distance. I thought that because it was being shown in a gallery with other artworks, that people would treat it like an artwork, but that's not at all really what happened. So I had built this replica of Los Angeles City Hall out of cardboard. And what I was trying to get at was this idea of authority and what authorities we listen to, because obviously City Hall is like one of the primary authorities in, Los Angeles as far as who gets to make law and policy and say how things go. But I was also thinking about how, a lot of the policy that is made there affects the people who are most vulnerable in our community. For instance, like nearby is Skid Row, where people literally live in cardboard boxes, but nobody really listens to them even about their own problems, and instead like makes policy on behalf of them. So that was one thing that I was thinking about. I was questioning like who we listen to, whom we believe, why we believe them. And then I was also thinking about the oracle as a traditional or historical way for women to be listened to. For instance, like the oracle at Delphi, which existed for thousands of years in a very patriarchal culture where women really weren't even allowed to participate in civic life or public life at all, was really one of the most important people in the classical world in terms of like being able to give advice or determine courses of action. And then similarly, like in spiritualist circles, like in the late 19th century, like that was another place that like women, for instance, like very young women could be heard and listened to and even speak politically, publicly, because they're saying, oh, well, this is coming from the spirits. It's not really coming from me. So therefore, it's probably some man like in the spirit world who's speaking through me, in which case, yes, you can listen to me. So I was thinking about all of these things. And then also I was thinking about just the ways that we induce trance or spiritual experiences, which usually require some kind of physical adjustment. So in order to consult the oracle, you had to crawl into the space. So, which is already an unusual thing to have to do in a gallery, and kind of enter this womb-like space and hold the hands of a stranger and all of that. And what I expected was that people would think, what is this artist trying to say by doing this? Like I expected that they would reflect in the same way that they might look at a painting and say, what was this artist trying to do? And I would assume I had assumed that they would either think that I was successful at trying to say what I was trying to say, or that I hadn't been able to do it in the way that I had tried. Like if I failed, that it would be because I failed to execute my idea correctly. But in fact, that's not at all what happened. What happened was either people would immediately come in and say, I don't believe in this. Like, I don't believe that this is real, which I thought was very strange, because it's not like, would you look at a painting and say, well, I don't believe in this, right. I don't believe in art. Like, it's like, what are you talking about? That doesn't even make sense. You would either say like, I don't think that this person is doing what they think they're doing, but just to say like full stop, I don't believe in it. I thought that was really interesting. And then the other people would be like, I do believe in this, absolutely. And like, tell me when I'm going to get married, or like, or would say these really personal, tell me these really personal things, like about how they had a miscarriage, or that they felt like they don't know where they belong, or that they're worried about their father who had died, and could I speak to that person? And and I found that really moving, that people were so vulnerable. And especially as an artist too, I think that probably most of the people who are here on this call now are artists in some capacity. And of course, as artists, at least for me, that's what you want. Like you want to really move someone. You want to really be there with them in a really profound and emotional and real and authentic space, even beyond aesthetic contemplation, which is what I had anticipated would happen. And what happened was so much deeper and richer than that. And I realized that in fact was a need. That was the work that I wanted to do. That was like that is what I felt like the world needed more of. And somehow that I was occupying a space where I could do that. And then, you know, like I hadn't really said that I was the Oracle of Los Angeles, but because I was in City Hall and on the night of the opening, people said, like, have you been in to visit the Oracle of Los Angeles? And then from that, I kind of was like, okay, yeah, this is it.
So wait. So so the Oracle of Los Angeles, was that a title for the artwork?
It was the title for the artwork. Yeah.
Okay. So it was the title for the artwork. So
I think it was like I can't remember.
I feel like there was some kind of signage or something
that you could, that you could,
that it was like
speak through to the city of Los Angeles or something like that.
Yeah. But that's fascinating. So like literally the title of your work of art became
the title of my life.
Yes. But I love that. I'm so interested in that space where art I'm always like art, like writing. So like writing is life, is spirituality, like these feel like it's like these are all part of the same thing. And I'm so interested in so much of my work is in that space between. It's like I'm not it's sort of deep meditations on experiences I've had and sort of turning them hermeneutically to look at different ways to seek to examine them and to let them be differently in the world, if that makes sense. So I absolutely love that this title of the work became you.
Yeah, I mean, that part has been really interesting because some people then have reacted by being like, well, by whose authority does she get to say that she's the Oracle of Los Angeles? And I love that because, first of all, I feel like, well, by my authority, I say that. And because I say it, it's true. And now it's written in the LA Times that I am. So like, I think that that's like the ultimate act of witchcraft, that like when we say something about ourselves, that it becomes true. But also another aspect of it is, I kind of think of it as like a band name, like Cat Power, Chan Marshall, Chan Marshall calls
Tracing
herself Cat Power. Yeah. And it gives you power to say, it does give you power. And I think that I wouldn't have been able, like, before I did that, I didn't really have the power and authority within myself to be able to say that I was this thing. And it wasn't until I had that gumption that that in fact I was able to start really working as a witch in the way that I do now. And it's an evolving process because I don't always feel like the Oracle of Los Angeles, as I speak to in my book, like a lot of the time.
Oh yeah.
I wish I was behaving like the Oracle of Los Angeles and really behaving much more like.
But one of the things that you also, in that section where you talk about that opening night, you make a distinction between speaking for and letting the city speak through you. And I think that that's also a really a feminist gesture, but it's also a really important distinction.
Yeah. I also, I want to clarify that I wasn't trying to, even though I was doing something which I had intended to be a practice of inviting aesthetic contemplation, I was actually trying to let the city speak through me. So it was my intention to listen deeply to the city and let it speak through me, not to speak as Amanda or speak, from kind of an intellectual perspective. And I don't know, what specifically around this idea of speaking for and to interests you?
I think the speaking for sometimes can I've seen this with somebody can sort of like put themselves as the mouthpiece of other people, right? And so and the seduction of authority can start to feed their ego, and so that actually they become invested in a power dynamic where they are the voice of X, Y, or Z, right?
That is very real.
Yeah. And which is, seems a really problematic and exploitative, but rather to have something speaking through seems like a very different position, the way that one's positioning, and it's a position of like the tarot, of like reading cards, right? Like you don't, like when you're reading cards, you're letting whatever, or this is my experience anyway, it's like you're letting the energy, the moment, come through you at that moment, right? But it's not, I don't know.
I mean, you're getting at a lot of really interesting questions. First of all, as someone who, now really does this work professionally and sees people one-on-one or does a lot of large group work, I can also say it is very tempting and something that one has to constantly guard against, to not speak for, and also not to inhabit a kind of authority that people actually want to give you. Like, people often are especially, in the places where they're most vulnerable, are really looking for an authoritative figure to come in and say, like, here's what you need to do. And it's very hard not to do that, especially for me, like when I was first starting out, because like I really wanted to be able to, like when someone comes to you and they're really hurting and they really want help, like you really want to give that to them. Like it's just like, I feel like it's a human impulse to want to want to try and offer them some comfort. And yet I feel like as a witch, the work that I'm really trying to do is to hold space to help people remember that they have that, like to hold space to help people contact their own intuition and the part of themselves that already knows that I don't know the answer, but that a part of them already does know that answer. So there's that part of it. But then I also think about how when we're speaking for, or we're speaking to, or we're speaking through, it kind of begs the question of like, well, who are we, right? Like, because all of us are so formed by the culture in which we live, the family in which we live, the biology of our, our genetic makeup. And like, I don't know who Amanda is to be able to speak. Like, she is made of all the things, like she's a context. I don't know, like that.
She's a context. I like that.
Like, I don't know if like when Amanda's speaking or the Oracle is speaking, like, who is that? Who
Absolutely.
are those people?
Yeah. So that actually, and I want to be able to leave a little space for questions and then still pull cards too, but or a card. But that makes me think of another thing in your book that I wanted to, where you talk about boundaries, right? And talk about the, like how important it is for witches, but also like, I just think for empaths, for people in the world to be able to start to actually be able to set clear boundaries, what boundaries are. And so some of the questions, I think there's a point where you say one of the questions that you ask, like you talk about how everything that comes in is going to influence you. Everything changes you. And so this question of, do I want this influence in my life? Which is such I love that framing because, I don't know about you, but I've had people use the language of boundaries in a very hurtful way where they're like, I just need to set a boundary. And my new boundary is like, you can only stay with me for 3 days when you come to Los Angeles for 10 days or whatever. Like that was a long time ago. Love her. Bless you. Go away. Yeah. So can you speak a little bit about about that, this, there's not really a question as much as like a what's coming up around,
like on the subject of boundaries.
Boundaries and protection. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when you're speaking of this idea about influence and whether or not we want to take on this influence, I mean, this is something that I can say that, like, our work as witches is never done, right? Like, we never become the ultimate, like, there's no end. It's a bottomless well, and we're always going to keep going. And so I've learned a lot about boundaries, and I still have a lot to learn. But about the idea of influence, like, I think a lot of the time, especially people are socialized as feminine, we don't know that we can decide who gets to be in our space or who gets to influence us. At least speaking for myself, especially as a very young woman, like in my 20s, I didn't know, even though I felt very boundaried, but in fact I wasn't. I was more like defensive, which I think is a different thing. And I would still let people in who hurt me, but I would just be kind of aggressive about how I let them in, I guess. But I didn't know that I could say no, really, because I'd never really been taught that I could determine for myself what my boundaries were, and or what influences I took on. And in fact, I think that it goes back to our discussion of like colonialism and capitalism, that, you know, we're just indoctrinated in this ideologies from such an early age that we, you know, when we literally don't have boundaries and don't have any way of constructing boundaries, we don't know what they are. We're just like sponges taking it in. And I think the thing is about influence that we have to remember as a witch, and this idea of, it goes back to this idea of guides. You know, a lot of the time in spiritual circles we hear, you know, we'll talk to your guides or listen to your guides. And the thing is like that we all have guides, and if we don't choose who our guides are, then they're assigned to us. And so often if we're living in like a white supremacist capitalist patriarchal culture, then we will be guided by that culture and by the ideologies of that culture unless we choose otherwise. So for instance, like we will make capital our guide, and that will be the thing that we follow and the thing that we pursue and the thing that we listen to, unless we choose to do otherwise, unless we make that conscious intention to make something else our guide. And so I think choosing who your influences are and what you want to be influenced by, and then devoting yourself to that thing, and celebrating it and honoring it. That goes back to what I was saying earlier about how we make a thing sacred through celebration and through ritual. Like, you know, we dance to it, we sing to it, we give it offerings, we celebrate its holy days, and that's in fact what makes something sacred to us. And that's why, for instance, when a colonizing force goes into a new land, it bans the holidays and it bans the dances and it bans the religion, because it wants to take away what is sacred to those people. And so really, you know, circling back to what you were saying about the environmental eschatology, you know, the end of the world that we're facing right now, is I believe that the only way forward is if we do see the world and the planet as sacred, and then we have to do the rituals that help us see that. That's kind of far off the territory of boundaries, I guess.
No, but I love it. I agree, you know, and I think it's also, and one last thing on boundaries, and then we can open it up to see if people have questions. And if people do have questions, let me just say, you can put them in the chat, or you can in the chat note that you would like to ask your question verbally, and we'll have a few minutes for questions. But one of the things I was going to say around that is that there's also the process, or in my process anyway, it's been a lot about recovering and remembering who the little parts and the little girls inside me are, because those were so squished. And so how to have boundaries with integrity, but to have integrity, you kind of have to know that your inside parts, which of course is, it's like endless, what was it? Teresa of Avila, who talks about like the interior castles, like it's just room after room after room after room, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's also so worth it. And then you're like, oh yeah, this little part, like little sensitive part that gets really upset, like, yeah, here, and here's a boundary for you.
I mean, maybe it's even more helpful to talk about not abandoning oneself in lieu of boundaries, because I think that that's what happens when we don't observe our boundaries a lot of the time, is like we abandon ourselves and let other people come kind of do what they want with our inner children, our inner vulnerable parts. But if we don't abandon ourselves, which means that we don't like leap on and start like adding more abuse, like I think that self-abandonment comes from when we, for instance, like someone does something to us that hurts us, and then we jump on our own back as like the superego owner, like, yeah, you always, like that always happens to you, and you never stand up for yourself, and you probably should have done this other thing, when really what we need is like our inner parent to come in and be like, I'm with you, like, I'm not gonna let this happen to you, I'm gonna protect you, I'm gonna care for you, and like, I love you, and there's nothing wrong with you. And then we don't have to worry so much about setting these hard and clear boundaries, because we just know we're going to be taken care of.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes sense. I think I grew up when it was, everyone was like, there's demons everywhere. And anything that you do can bring demons into the house. And there would be these stories at church about like, Tara saw a demon in the hallway. just super terrifying.
Imagine.
Yeah. So this thing about like boundaries and protection has been sort of an obsession for a long time.
And yet I just feel like living in this culture, which that as I've grown older and have educated myself more and more, and it's like I don't think like violent is a good enough word. Like I don't think it really gets like the violence of white supremacy and colonialism is so horrifying and brutal and totalizing, and the way that it treats people, the environment, animals, people, of course, people of color especially, but like there are demons everywhere. Like in a colonialist culture, there are demons everywhere, because like we're living in a place where there's like residues of obscene violence everywhere. And I think that a lot of the time in religious practices that can't allow for quote unquote shadow, or can't allow for like internal interrogation of one's own complicity, then that gets externalized as demonic forces.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so I guess, is there
I just want to make clear that I'm not saying demons make us behave like white supremacists. I'm saying that like the kind of the forces of violence are here and present, and that that when we say that like that there is a demon, like there is some kind of a residue of that karmic misdeed is what I'm getting at. I'm not saying that like the devil made us do it or whatever, just to clarify.
No, right, absolutely. No, and actually, I mean, I think that like one of the thinkers that I was looking at with writing my book is Paul Tillich, who is like a theologian, but he talks about that authoritarianism, like the idea that my way is the only way, that actually is what is demonic. He actually, so when you say like there are all these demons, it's like, yes, this, these systems that would have one believe that this is the only way, right?
Yeah.
Which is
that right? The ends justify the means, like that, to get to this like state of like, utopia, that we have to kill 6 million people, or
exactly.
Yeah, that is demonic.
Yes. 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 So, okay. Let's see here. I'm feeling like maybe that there's not necessarily questions. I'm just kind of looking in the chat, but I'm also just trying to be mindful of the time. And I'm feeling like the energy is like, maybe it's time to pull a card. Sure. I don't know. Does that seem right?
Sure.
Okay. So do you want to pull let's both pull a card.
Okay.
And also, Shameka is in the chat, is posting, thank you, Shameka, ways to get in touch with Amanda. So if people have not read her book, it's amazing, but also she has an amazing podcast called Between the Worlds.
This Thursday we're coming out with season number 3, which is on the swords and tarot, which is all about conflict and truth. So it should be a really good season.
Amazing. Yes. So please do check her out. Also, Shameka is doing a series around poetry and movement. And so I don't know if you've posted that in the link. Here, see, this is little St. Lucy in my deck. St. Clair, love her. Okay. Are those your wind chimes?
They are. They're always talking.
They're great.
Yeah. Just for anybody who wanted to follow me on Instagram as well, I put my handle in the chat, which is at Oracle Vela, or you can find me on Facebook at Oracle Vela, I think, as well, or Amanda YATES GARCIA, one of those. But so for my tarot pull, I got the 2 of Wands. What do you get?
Wait, let me see. Okay, wait just a second.
I would also love to hear, even if people don't have questions, maybe things that came up for people, or thoughts, like even 1 or 2 sentences of thoughts that came up, or things that might apply to their own life. I think it might be nice to hear how people connected or talked to their own work, maybe while we're expounding on the, even if it's just one word or 1 sentence. I would love to know.
That's a great, I would love that too. I got the Page of Cups.
Ooh, nice. Okay. How do you interpret that?
So I'm going to, in my deck, on the Page of Cups is a picture of the lovers. So this, and so I'm having this thing around the lovers as actually also being like, the lover is the one inside you who you're waiting to meet and greet, right? And so, and I think about the page as being a student of one's own heart, right? And so, I'm saying, I feel like this is something around encouraging people to really like treat themselves well, right? To like really hold, it's like that kind of, to hold themselves with grace, with sensuality, to like do things that like physically in the body make you feel good, right?
Yes, I see that.
Yeah.
I love the idea of the pages being a student of one's own heart. I definitely think of the pages as being like the children of the court cards. And of course, yeah, with the cups as being the heart. So the children of the heart, and the enthusiasm and the inquiry and the curiosity that they bring. Absolutely. Um, for the Two of Wands, so wands are the tools of invocation. They're what draw things in, right? They're conduits for divine energy. And they also represent creativity, life force energy, sexuality, eros. And twos are about gathering and collecting one's resources. Specifically, the Two of Wands for me is about being rooted in your traditions and then considering how you want to expand upon those traditions or where you want to take them. So it's about acknowledging your teachers, but then also deciding how you can carry forth the teachings of your teachers and how you can expand upon them, modify them, reflect on them. So I would say that Spirit is inviting us now to consider like what our lineage is, whether it's our lineage as writers, lineages as people of our family or people of our, of our collective family, artists, and to think about like what those teachings are, specifically if we're relating it to your card, the page of cups, thinking about who were our teachers, who are our teachers of the heart, and how do we want to carry that knowledge forward into future work and iterations. I mean, I think about that a lot for myself as an art witch, as a writer witch as well, that like who did I learn from? Like who are the people that the giants on whose shoulders I'm standing? And then also, how do I want to take that work forward? And not everything that I learned, I don't agree with necessarily everything, but there are some things that I want to change or modify or expand upon. So
absolutely. I also feel like the combination of these two cards would be great for people to listen to your recent Q&A about making bread.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that was a fun one.
Yeah. And especially here on St. Lucia Day, when what you would traditionally make her, these kind of saffron buns, right, to offer to her, and she would offer them to people, right?
That's right. I remember.
And also, people didn't hear this, but Amanda actually she wore the amazing fire candle halo in Sweden. Were you in Sweden?
No, but so I was brought up practicing witchcraft, but my mother and my family also belong to the Unitarian Church because they allow for all of that kind of stuff. And so, at the Unitarian Church in Santa Barbara, which is where I grew up, I was Santa Lucia because we celebrate all the different holidays of all these different traditions and cultures. And so I wore the crown with the candles and offered rolls to people in my congregation. And then ironically as well, so the first thing that Teresa said when we got on the line today was like, oh, I see you have a saint on your wall, a picture of a saint. And I said, yeah, it's so funny. I don't remember the name of this saint, but I got this picture when I was in Crete, and the last chapter of my book is set in Crete, and at this nunnery there. And I was like, it's the one of the saint with the eyes on her palms. And she said that today is her day, and that is my saint as well. So she's just right back up there. It's her right there. That one up there.
Great.
So it is definitely a day of Saint Lucia.
Yes, Saint Lucia. But also, I love the then we'll close out. But in that episode too, you talk about making bread as a ritual, but also evoking the heritage or like the traditions, like the thinking about ancestry and lineage as part of that practice.
Yeah. That we all have. I mean, whether or not we come from a religious background, there's like we've all been fed. So families have all been fed for endless years. This has been such a blessing to be with all of you. I'm so grateful to look out there and see all of your faces. I wish that I could hear from all of you and know like what you're thinking and where you are in your own practices and with your own work. And it's really a blessing to be here with all this amazing community.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And thank you, everyone who's been putting things in the chat to talk, you know, like a word or a sentence or
Yeah,
whatever.
so wonderful to hear.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'm going to remove spotlights so I can see everyone. And that concludes our session for this evening. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It's so great to see. Hi, now I can see all your faces. I can see Maggie. Hi, Maggie. And Pat. Hello, Pat. And Anna. Hello.
Sounds like Romper Room when she used to have the magic mirror and she used to say hello to everybody.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Oh, I loved that. Like the first switch in our life was from Romper.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. And hi, Lydia. Oh, it's so great to see people. So have a wonderful evening. And if people want to hang out and chat for a little bit too, I'm going to just be here for a minute too. So, hey, Sarah. Everybody should read Sarah's article on Casadega.
Ooh,
the New York Times.
Good.
It was so good.
Congrats, Sarah.
Hey, Amber.
I'm going to go read that. I'm going to write that down.
And Pam.
Thank you both so much. This was wonderful. And Teresa, excited for the future of the series. And Amanda, incredible. Thank you for this fantastic hour. I'm going to go. I hear my toddler needs to eat dinner, I suppose. But thank you both so much. And thank you to Shameka, who did so much to hold the space as well. We're very grateful. So good night, everybody.
So it's been such a pleasure. Oh, there's Sarah's article.
Oh, good. Oh, hey, Larkin. Wait.
I have lost the chat button, so I'm just waving.
Okay. Hi.
Thank you so much for this.